Hello, in this video, we're going to talk about a special ES6 syntax called arrow functions. So an arrow function is a syntactic shortcut for declaring functions in JavaScript. So an arrow function is just a function. There's nothing, it works exactly like a normal function does. It's just a different way of writing that function. So the way it works, we have our normal function declaration in literal format. We've talked about this before. So I'm going to sort of throw it into a slide so you can see the manipulation. So the way we've done this is we've defined our function as our function literal, and we assigned it to a variable called foo. That's the name of our function. What an arrow function does, it says that's a lot of typing, right? I mean, we already know this thing is a function, so why are we writing out the word function? So in an arrow function, we're going to delete the word function, and instead we're going to add an arrow between the parameter list and the body of the function. That's it. That's how we create a function. Like all we've done is we crossed out the word function and we add an arrow instead. Otherwise, it's exactly the same thing, right? These two statements, these function declarations produce the exact same function. This one just requires writing about 5 characters less. Okay. Arrow functions do have some other advantages in terms of how they scope variables, which won't impact what we're doing much in this course, but it does tend to clean up some other things, sort of like on the edge cases around JavaScript. Great. So that creates an arrow function, right? This is what's called a block body arrow function because it still has the block for its body. And that's it. It's a shortcut way of writing functions. Now, we can, of course, make this even shorter if we wanted to. Now, because it's JavaScript, we can, of course, ignore white space. We can put the whole thing on one line. And if this code happens to only have one line of code, right, it's just a single return statement, we might say, like, well, that seems kind of redundant if it's just one line of code. So we can actually delete the block itself, right, delete the semicolon, the curly braces, and get rid of the keyword return. And that lets us write this one-liner line of code as a single line of code. This is what's called a arrow function. This is still an arrow function, right? It still has an arrow. This is what's called a concise body arrow function because we're writing this down in a very concise, core structured way. Now, to be clear, we don't actually, if we have no parameters, for example, right? If we're just trying to say hello world, then all we're going to do is we would delete the parameters, right, from our list, but everything else stays exactly the same. This gets a little bit funky. This is where the syntax starts falling apart, I think, right? A little bit, because they're like, oh, look, foo is equal to empty parentheses, arrow. Wow. It stops being, it often becomes harder and harder to read. And that's just one of the challenges of arrow functions. The same thing happens if we're in the full body, the block body format, right? So we go back to our arrow function here. If there are no arguments, then you end up just having the empty parentheses along the way. Which, again, a little bit awkward, but at least we have a block body to indicate this is a function. Cool. So that's arrow function syntax. That's it. We delete the word function and we put an arrow between the parameters and the block. We're done. Okay. Arrow functions are, I said, they have some properties around variable scoping that's useful but not immediately relevant to the kind of work we're doing in this course. They are particularly nice when you're using them for anonymous callbacks or for function literals. And in fact, if ever you're using a function that takes a callback, map, filter, add event listener, anything like that, you really should be using an arrow function instead. It's considered best practice and better approaches to use arrow functions. So as an example, if I had an array I was working with, I could write this out as using a normal function literal, right? Array.map with our function, this is like by normal. I could switch this to being an arrow syntax where I'm now saying map each number into this kind of result. And that's actually kind of the behavior that I'm looking for, right? That's what I'm trying to find. And so this both makes it read a little bit better, and it takes less typing, and it fixes some scope variables. So it's overall better practice. And ever you're using .map, .filter, .add event listener, .sort, any of these functions that takes in a callback, that accepts a function as an argument, you should be using an arrow function there instead. It is possible to do this as a concise body, right? Map each number into that number times 2. This is okay only for really tiny or really simple expressions, right? Like multiplying by 2. If it gets any more complicated than that, don't use a concise body. Stick with your sort of map structure. Again, this can be really useful then also if you're trying to find functions that are getting assigned to objects. So really you want to be using arrow functions for callbacks, right? For map, filter, add event listener, right? For these sort of instead of function literals. That said, you want to be using normal function declarations for other kinds of structures. Okay, cool. Let's make sure everyone, in order to test your understanding, so here's sort of the quiz slide. So out of these 4 different options, which one of these has the correct syntax? And you're welcome to pause the video, read through them, and take a look and see if you can figure out which one is written correctly. You've had hopefully you have a chance to check it on your own. The correct answer is D. D is the correct syntax for writing out an arrow function. With A, the problem is my arrows are in the wrong order, right? The arrow comes after the argument list, before the block, not between the assignment and the option. With B, the challenge here is that we don't actually include the word function, right? We just want to have the arrow instead. With C, the problem is we have to have a return statement with a block body arrow function. Unlike in R or some other languages, it doesn't automatically, an arrow function doesn't automatically return the last expression. You still need to have an explicit return statement along with that. And that leaves D as our correct structure for writing an arrow function. Okay, so we now have four different ways of writing functions in JavaScript, all of which do the exact same work. They all create functions that we can call. We've got 4 different ways of doing it because JavaScript is nothing if not accepting of lots of different options. So we have function declarations. This is sort of our standard or initial approach. We can take function literals and assign them to variables. We can do arrow functions, and then we can do concise body arrow functions. Function declaration should be your normal approach. If you're just writing a top-level function, if you're just creating a function that's going to sort of sit anywhere, kind of at the beginning of your code, just sits inside your script, that you should use a function declaration. That's the correct way of writing function. That's considered best style and best practice. Arrow functions are the right things to use for callbacks, for anonymous functions, for function literal. So instead of using the function literal syntax, you would use an arrow function syntax instead. So arrow functions really are replacing the literal syntax, but function declarations aren't replaced by arrows. They can be, but they shouldn't be. In practice, you should still use function declarations here. Okay. The other code style note that I want to be really, really explicit about is don't use concise body arrow functions. Like, I know I just introduced them and we just said that was a thing that exists, right? That's one of our options. Don't do this. Always include the explicit block. So if we look at our concise body syntax, it's hard to read. It's hard to see that this is a function at a glance, right? If I'm starting to parse this just like as a person reading language, like the first thing I see is I see const foo, and I think, great, I'm making a variable, right? What's the variable equal to? Well, the variable is equal to empty array, empty brackets. And then my brain immediately starts questioning, like, wait a second, what's going on here? Why do you mean you've assigned this to something else, right? If this took in foo, right, and this refers foo plus foo, right? My first thought is like, okay, you're assigning foo to an argument, to a variable, but you put parentheses around it for some reason. What's going on there? It actually requires you to get to the next token, the 5th token in the list here, to see, oh, this whole thing is a function. Oh, and like, so it means you've read half the code statement before you actually understand the context of what you're trying to read in the first place. That's not great, right? That makes it's doable. It just requires more mental effort and it makes it harder to read the code. Not impossible, but harder. Using the block structure, right? Using a block body makes it very clear that's a function because you can see that there's curly braces, there's indentation. Like you get sort of this like high level view that, oh, there's something going on here, so that when you see that arrow, you understand you're dealing with a function. Block bodies are easier to modify. We can add additional code statements to them. Like if I want to debug this and I want to, for example, try to write console log foo, right? I want to log out that variable and see if I was getting the right result. I can't do that, right? I can't write in additional debugging statements. I can't write in additional logic. I can't expand it and modify it and make it do more complex things later. I have to convert it back to a block body function, so we might as well leave it a block body in the first place, right? Might as well put the curly braces because it'll let us be able to debug and fix it and do these things better. So they're easier to modify, they're easier to debug, they're easier to read. Block body is the correct way of using arrow functions. Concise bodies will work, but I strongly recommend not using. So again, out of our 4 function syntaxes, the way that we're going to do this is we use function declarations for top level sort of general functions, and we're going to use block body arrow functions, right? Without the sort of don't do the concise version, do the sort of the full version, full arrow functions for anything that would use a literal or a callback along.